It's Tuesday, June 10th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today in the show, we are staying with the unrest in Los Angeles because last night there were some big changes after the Department of Defense did end up moving U.S. Marines to the city of Los Angeles, which might be illegal, at least it seems like it on paper, if they're actually given a mission. But it's left a lot of people asking, how can this happen? Can Trump do what he's been doing without consequence? And what will happen next? And I will try to answer those questions as best I can today. But before I do, please make sure that you're following and subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you listen to this on. And also follow the show and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new video versions of Make It Make Sense. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a bunch of new articles going up all the time. It is just $5 a month to get access to those, and it really helps support the show and keep this thing going. And as always, share the show on social media. You can support it there by tagging MIMS Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word in every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. And with that out of the way, let's get to today's episode. Last night, Donald Trump authorized the Department of Defense to mobilize 700 U.S. Marines from 29 Palms Marine Base in California to be sent to downtown L.A., where they have been told that they're supposed to be helping to protect federal buildings and personnel, but also in cooperation with state and local government leaders. That's important and something we'll come back to here in a little bit. But this is a really big deal. It tests the boundaries of the law, of our military, of our service members, and presidential power and our civil rights and what it means for our civil rights. But before I get ahead of myself here, let's talk about the first question. Can Trump actually do what he's doing? The answer is broadly considered to be no. There are two big laws that get cited when you talk about whether a president can deploy the military within the U.S. borders. The first one is the Posse Comitatus Act from 1878 that bans the use of specifically the Army, and then later it was amended to say the Air Force as well, from being deployed or used in active missions within U.S. borders. In Latin, Posse Comitatus means literally the power of country. It's a law that was written and passed directly after the Civil War, and you can see why they would want this to have been passed in an effort post-Civil War to bring the country back together. The other law that bans the use of military, rather purely federal troops from being deployed or assigned detail in the U.S., we'll talk about the National Guard here in a second. They're a little bit different, but technically still covered under this law. It's a law that doesn't have a fancy Latin name. It is just Title 10, Section 275 of the U.S. Code of Law. It was put in place to include the Navy and Marines, as well as sometimes the Coast Guard, and it also sometimes includes Space Force now. And you'll see all the military branches covered under both Posse Comitatus and Section 275, depending on the interpretation of the Constitution you're looking at. But what isn't up for interpretation is that it is against the law in one form or fashion to deploy American troops to U.S. cities, except for under some really specific conditions. Now, the first one is one that Trump invoked over the weekend, and that is a legal exception that allows the president to federalize specifically National Guard troops in times of rebellion or in times that we are in danger of a rebellion. Again, no fancy name for that. It is just part of U.S. law that was passed in 1903. Now, that law does require the orders to make National Guard troops full federal troops to go through the state's governor, because the governor of your state is generally considered the commander of your National Guard. And that's where we get the idea that governors need to request the president to federalize the National Guard. It's not just a formality, but a preservation of states' rights, the freedom from the encroachment of the federal government on a state's ability to govern its people within its borders. It's a little heady and a little in the weeds, but it is important because it is a bedrock part of how the United States operates. And just as important, Trump didn't do that in California when it came to the National Guard. He went around Governor Gavin Newsom, and Newsom, like I said yesterday, is now suing over it. And the law around whether Trump actually needs a governor to ask him to take control of the National Guard is murky at best. This section of the law is written kind of vaguely, likely with the idea in mind that the people who wrote it couldn't fully encompass everything that was going to come their way, and so they left some things open for interpretation. And it's something that's been debated since essentially right after that part of the law was put in place in the 1950s, just before President Dwight D. Eisenhower federalized National Guard troops to protect integrating students in Little Rock, Arkansas. But if you're sitting there and you're going, okay, so that's the National Guard and they get called in and we've seen that before, but what about the Marines? That seems different. And you're right, it is something else, and I'm right there with you. So the law that lets the president use military force within U.S. borders, which we are talking about, I guess now Space Force, but Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, broadly speaking, again, sometimes Coast Guard, not really all the time though. That is the Insurrection Act, and it was signed by Thomas Jefferson in 1807 and says that a president can have U.S. American troops on active duty on U.S. soil in times of rebellion or to protect the civil rights of a group of people. It's been invoked 30 times over the course of our 250-year history, only once nationally, and that was during the Civil War. Otherwise, it's been used in small capacities with limited scopes, like against slave rebellions or white supremacist uprising post the Civil War, or suppressing and ending strikes in places like Colorado and West Virginia, or in suppressing large riots, the most recent of them being in 1992 in LA during the Rodney King riots. And to be very clear, Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act as I'm recording this, at least not yet. So it would mean that reading just the letter of the law, what's on paper, would mean that sending in 700 Marines to join the 2,100 or so federalized National Guard troops is illegal. But there is one more thing, and that's that the White House doesn't believe that it broke the law. I mean, obviously, but also it doesn't believe that because there's been a long-standing belief among White House legal counsels and legal offices for Democratic and Republican presidents alike that the executive branch, which is to say the president, can send in federal or federalized troops to protect federal agents or federal property without having to invoke the Insurrection Act in certain limited capacities when buildings or personnel are being attacked with things like bricks or Molotov cocktails, things that we would generally consider overtly violent. Now, most legal scholars will tell you that it is at best a loophole understanding of how the Insurrection Act is meant to work, and at worst, a willful misreading of the laws that prevent U.S. troops from being sent in to police American citizens on U.S. soil. Because we don't get to these points very often, it hasn't been tested a whole lot in courts. So we really don't have a lot to go on from judges about whether or not presidents can do this. So at the very least, these are extremely murky legal waters that we are treading in right now. As all of that gets worked out, because it is getting worked out in the courts right now, there are still Marines just hanging out in L.A. along with National Guard troops. So what are they doing? Well, mainly nothing. Like I said, kind of hanging out. They don't really have real orders right now other than to protect federal buildings and personnel. Now, the LAPD has said that they have things under control, so they really don't have anything for the troops nor the Marines to do. And because Trump didn't go through the governor, there are no orders from the state either, so they're just kind of there. But that's not as harmless as it sounds. As Georgetown law professor Stephen Vladeck said in his article on his Substack this week, the concern here is that because protecting is vague and undefined, it will mean that these Marines will end up using force on U.S. citizens because they don't know what their actual jobs are, which means things are getting increasingly more and more tense every day and every hour they're there. And on top of that, there's a secondary part of this, and it's the big difference between the National Guard and the U.S. military. Now, first of all, National Guard training is different. They're trained to be disaster relief and crowd control most of the time. Conventional warfighting training is part of what they do, absolutely, but it is not the same, nor is it as comprehensive as full-time active duty military, especially Marines, who have longer basic trainings. Their physical requirements are generally considered to be more strict than other branches of the military, and every Marine is trained in infantry combat on top of their military duties, which isn't always the case for other branches. So to put it simply here, they are trained for one thing, and that is to fight war. And that's a big deal because how you're trained is going to affect how you approach a given situation. It's the old saying, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Now, the other major difference here between the National Guard and the Marines is that National Guard troops are generally from the states that they're serving in, that they're called up to serve in. They have a personal connection to those places and the people. In some cases, they're from the same cities and might find themselves in the same neighborhoods that they're from now that they're deployed. I mean, the slogan for the California National Guard on its website is live here, serve here. That's how powerful this idea is. Now, I'm not saying that the Marines from 29 Pines don't have a connection to California or Los Angeles or don't have empathy or humanity for the people that they're now looking at, but a lot of them are from around the country and don't have a connection to LA and to the people they're now being forced to face off against. And broadly, sending in the Marines, regardless of how legal it is or isn't, is, by most expert beliefs, meant to be an escalation here. In a new story out today from the Wall Street Journal, it's all about how White House Deputy Chief of Staff and anti-immigrant zealot Stephen Miller has effectively directed ICE agents to stop targeting criminals, but just go after all places where they think undocumented immigrants might be, which includes schools, hospitals, churches, places of work, and places like Home Depots and 7-Elevens, like I talked about in Thursday's episode last week when Miller blew up at a group of ICE officials. And in this story, an expert from the nonpartisan organization, the Migration Policy Institute, said to do the raids in militaristic gear in LA is intended to notch up the image of deportations being in high gear. But the actual deportations are paltry compared with the imagery. And that gets at this less tangible idea that I've sort of only glanced at during this episode. And it's that when presidents have done this in the past, it's been a really painstaking process. And they've chosen to come close to the Insurrection Act or to federalize troops after a lot of thought because of the imagery of that. It cuts at the very core of our ideals of freedom, of self-determination, of states' rights. Those are foundational parts of who we are as America, but also just the images themselves of having the streets of a major iconic American city being occupied by armed soldiers, Americans or not, is a real shift away from democracy. We don't solve our issues with bullets and bayonets, or at least we're not supposed to be doing that. But ICE officials and now members of the U.S. military have been vaguely charged with protecting those same officials who are being given no directives, but officers have been told to, quote, do what you need to do to make more arrests, according to sources who talk to the Wall Street Journal. So it's not hard to see how something could go wrong that could lead to something akin to real fighting on the streets of an American city, which is the thing that past presidents have actively wanted to avoid, and in which here the president and the White House currently seem to be actively inviting. Case in point, Trump continues to encourage the arrest of Governor Gavin Newsom for what crime we don't know, but here he is talking about it to reporters on the White House lawn.
Did he do it? I would do it if I was Tom. I think it's great. Look, Gavin likes the publicity, but I think it would be a great thing. He's done a terrible job. Look.
And this is important because there's sort of an unwritten rule in the White House that when Trump says something twice, he's serious about it. And this is now the second or maybe third time Trump has suggested that Gavin Newsom be arrested. And that will send ripples through the White House, through the Department of Homeland Security, and through ICE. Now, moving on, Trump, in this same little press gaggle, said that he thinks the people causing damage or attacking officers or troops are professionals.
Those that are causing the problem are professional agitators, they're insurrectionists, they're bad people, they should be in jail.
Now, Trump has no proof that these people are professionals. It's the same thing as him saying that immigrants are invading the U.S., which is something that the Department of Justice nor the White House has been able to prove in courts. And when they've tried to make those arguments, they have been shot down by conservative and liberal judges alike. But the combination between saying these are pros and that Newsom is guilty of something leaves the door open for an argument to be made that the unrest in California was and is orchestrated and organized, which could be convincing to a judge, or more likely the White House legal counsel, which is probably already working on just this thing, to invoke the Insurrection Act, to be able to claim that the unrest is an organized rebellion or organized insurrection, and then all bets are off. Now, no one really knows what's going to happen next, and I think you're going to hear a lot of people say that LA is a powder keg right now, waiting to explode. And I think that's the wrong metaphor. I think it's a snare, and that LA is the rabbit. The White House seems poised and ready to spring into action as soon as the rabbit takes the bait. And that could be anything from a protester throwing a brick at a Marine or a federal officer shooting at a journalist, something that we have seen on camera at least twice now in 3 days, that causes a larger thing to happen, or maybe it's something that we can't even foresee happening. But it does seem like the administration is appearing to be setting a trap and is hoping somebody, anyone, will spring it. Okay, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube for notifications for any new video episodes. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got more articles coming out this week, all about what's happening in LA and the stuff that we're not looking at when we're looking at LA right now, because there are still things happening in DC right now. If you don't want to do that, no sweat, but please share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. It's MIMS News Pod on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.